Number one, we have a huge budget deficit. Even if we didn't want to expand the size of government, even if we want to contract the size of government, we still have a gigantic budget deficit. And the debt is about 85% by some measures of gross domestic product. And the question is, how do you get the deficit down? How do you get the debt down? Well, almost everybody who has looked at the issue has said it's got to be some combination of tax increases and spending cuts. The Simpson-Bowles Commission, to which my esteemed colleague referred to, said, well, we have $1 of tax increases for every $3 of spending cuts. But there are going to be some tax increases, and the real question here isn't the size of government. The real question here is who is going to bear the brunt of the tax increases? Is it going to be people mostly at the top, or is it going to be people who are in the middle, or is it going to be people who are poor? And I want to tell you, in terms of common sense and logic and fairness, it ought to be people at the top. Why? Why? You can applaud, but don't take away from my time. Why? Because number one, people at the top have never had it so good. I mean, the percentage of total income in this country going to people who are in the top 1% has doubled over the past 30 years. It used to be 10% back in 1980. It's now over 20%. That is, people in the top 1% are now getting over 20% of total income. If you're in the top 1/10 of 1%, your share didn't just double, it actually tripled over the last 30 years. If you're in the top 1/100th of 1%, your share quadrupled of total income over the last 30 years. The richest 400 Americans have more wealth than the bottom 150 million of us put together. And this kind of asymmetry, this kind of distorted gap between the top and the wealthiest people and everybody else is really something new in this country, at least within people's living memory. It wasn't this way in the 50s or 60s or 70s. It wasn't even nearly this way in the 80s. So if we're going to have to raise taxes, obviously fairness and logic would indicate you raise them on the top. Now, Glenn Hubbard is talking about, well, you have a negative effect on a negative incentive effect. Come on, as in the immortal words of Joe Biden, malarkey. I mean, look, the tax rate, the marginal tax rate on top incomes, go back before 1981. For at least 3 decades before 1981, the top marginal tax rate in this country was at least 70%. Under Dwight D. Eisenhower, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, Republican, who nobody would have accused of being a socialist. Bill O'Reilly would not have called him a communist. And yet, the marginal tax rate on the top incomes under Eisenhower was 91%. If you get rid of all the deductions and tax credits, it's still, the effective tax rate under Eisenhower is close to 56%, much higher than anybody today is talking about. Right now, we're talking about the difference between what? A 35% tax rate and maybe going back to Bill Clinton's days? I mean, this is a ridiculous debate. It should not even be debated. Obviously, given where we were before and where we are now, we shouldn't even be raising this question. I mean, they will say that higher taxes have a negative impact on economic growth. Well, guess what? In the 3 decades before 1981, when taxes were higher on the rich, the economy, on average, per year, grew faster than it has grown since 1981. There was no negative impact on growth. I mean, George W. Bush reduces, remember 1981, 2001, 2003, he reduces taxes on the wealthy, saying, oh, we're going to get this huge increase in growth, and we're going to get all kinds of jobs, using and spouting supply-side, excuse me, Art, nonsense. And what did we get? We actually had less growth. We had fewer jobs. Even before the Great Crash, we had an economy that did not perform nearly as well as it did under the president I was very proud to have served under, that is Bill Clinton, who raised taxes. We had the largest and longest boom in modern memory. 22 million new jobs were created. That wasn't a negative growth. That was not a slowdown in growth. We raised taxes. 22 million new jobs were created. I was Secretary of Labor during those times. I created every single one of those jobs. Thank you. Thank you very much. Just in summary, we have to raise taxes in order to deal with the budget deficit, regardless of what your particular ideology is about a smaller or larger government. Number two, the rich have done extraordinarily well. Everybody else hasn't. In fact, median family incomes since 2000 have actually dropped 8%. You want to put more taxes on average working people? No. That's simply not fair. It's not going to work. Number three, the rich right now bear a lower, smaller marginal tax burden than they have at any time in the post-war era. Of course you have to raise taxes on the rich if we're going to get on with the business of this country. So please, vote against this silly proposition.
But you look at it, there are only three reasons you could possibly want to raise tax rates on the rich. You're jealous of them. And Robert may be, but he's one of them. And the other thing is you're going to get more revenue, and you're going to create prosperity. Those are the other two, and I'm going to land on the last two and look at the facts if I can. I mean, you know, in the 30 years, if you look at the growth rates there, and we can go back in time, but you know, if you look at the periods, let's say from the Roaring '20s, we cut tax rates back then from 73% to 25% in the Roaring '20s. It was called the Roaring '20s for a reason. We had enormous expansion of growth, output, and employment. The top 1% of income earners. Now, we have great data on the top 1% of income earners. The IRS really likes to know how much you owe them. And we have great data. The top 1% of income earners, their taxes as a share of GDP soared during the period of the Roaring '20s. If you look at the 1930s, we raised the highest margin. Well, we first had in May of 1930, we had the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Then Hoover raised the highest tax rate on the rich from 25% to 63%. Then Roosevelt on January 1936 raised it from 63 to 79%, and then up to 83%. There's a reason why it was called the Great Depression. The economy was in a shambles, in large part because of the tax increases. The revenues from the top 1% of income earners as a share of GDP went down during this period. You look at the Kennedy period, where we cut the highest tax rate from 91% to 70%. We also put in the investment tax credit, accelerated depreciation, cut the corporate rate, did tariff reform as well, the Kennedy round tariff negotiation. Tax rate, it was called the go-go 60s, if you remember, a boom in the economy. And tax revenues from the top 1% of income earners went up during that period as a share of GDP. We then had the four stooges: Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Carter. Which I consider to be the largest assemblage of bipartisan ignorance probably ever put on planet Earth. If you look at that period, we had stagnation for 16 straight years. The stock market collapsed during that period. Tax revenues from the top 1% of income earners went down as a share of GDP. Then we had, oh, excuse me, does anyone have any water? No, excuse me, then we had Ronnie. Oh, excuse me, the skies opened, the sun shone forth on the planet. The grass turned green, the animals, they multiplied, the children danced in the streets. We cut the highest tax rates of everything we could find. We had Steiger-Hansen in '78. Then we cut under Reagan, cut it from 70% to 28%. If you look at the whole period from 1978 all the way to 2007, we cut the highest tax rate on earned income from 50% to 35%. We cut the highest tax rates on unearned income from 70% to 15%. We cut the capital gains tax rate. We cut all of these tax rates across the board. We had a boom, and it wasn't just Ronald Reagan, Robert. Your president, by the way, cut the capital gains tax rate dramatically. He got rid of capital gains taxes on owner-occupied homes for everyone. He also got rid of the tax on retirees working, which was this group between 65 and 72. He also put in welfare reform. He also cut government spending as a share of GDP by more than the next 4 best presidents combined. And he had the greatest Secretary of Labor of all time. But he was a big tax cutter. We had huge growth during that period. If you look at what happened to the tax revenues from the top income earners, you know, in 1980, tax revenues as a share of GDP from the top 1% was 1.5% of GDP. By 2007, tax revenues from the top 1% of income earners was 3.2% of GDP. It more than doubled. Let me tell you really honestly, you're not going to get the money from these guys. You're not. They can hire lawyers. They can hire accountants. They can hire deferred income specialists. They can hire congressmen. They can hire senators. They can hire, you know, when you see a group of people hanging with the president, don't for a moment think it's a group of street people trying to explain to the president what it's like being poor. They're in there for some reason, and they find it. You know, what you really want to do is get a low-rate, flat tax where you have no exceptions, no exemptions, no deductions, none of that stuff, and get them out of the business of trying to finagle their tax codes, get them out of the business of trying to influence government, get them into a position where they create prosperity and economic growth, and that is the way you got to go. We all want to increase tax rates on the rich, but we want to do it not by raising rates, which won't work. We want to do it by lowering rates and broadening the base. And if I can correct one other little mistake, Robert, just a little one, Simpson Bowles lowers the highest tax rates on the rich. And so does Rivlin Domenici. They lower rates, they broaden the base. In '86, we cut tax rates on the rich dramatically from 50% to 28%. In the Senate, 97 votes for that, 3 against it, including Joe Biden. What was his malarkey comment? Excuse me, maybe he was looking in the mirror. But you also had Bill Bradley. You also had Howard Metzenbaum. You had all of these. And you had Chris Dodd, and you had Teddy Kennedy. Everyone knows that you don't create growth by raising tax rates on the rich. You can't love jobs and hate job creators. And you can't tax an economy into prosperity. It ain't going to happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Art Laffer. Thank you, Art Laffer.